Hey guys, it's Mathil here once again, and today I want to talk everything there is to know about jewels, at least from my perspective, and hopefully by the end of the video you can then identify a jewel for a build, whether it's good or not, and maybe even attach a price associated with that jewel. So let's start with the basics. You can look up just about everything there is that I'm going to be talking about on the Path of Exile wiki itself under the Jewel tab, and it goes over just about everything. It may get a bit overwhelming though. The basics are, there are three different types of jewels: Cobalt, Crimson, and Viridian. The main difference between the three is what kind of mods they can get on them. So Cobalt, for example, is more of a spellcaster jewel because it can get spell damage rolls, most elemental damage rolls like fire elemental, fire damage, cold damage, lightning damage, all that sort of stuff. Whereas a Crimson jewel, much more of a melee-based jewel, much more physical damage orientated. So it's going to have two-hand weapon damage and melee damage. Whereas a Viridian jewel, more of the projectile sort of jewel, and you can really kind of identify them by the passive tree areas more or less. Everything on this side will pretty much be associated with Crimsons, everything up here will be Cobalts, and everything over here will be Viridians. There are some overlaps with jewels. Of course, some of them can get just about every mod, but for the most part, if you're going to be playing a spellcaster, you're probably going to be looking to roll jewels or buy jewels that are Cobalts, for example. So that's starting out there. They can have 4 properties at most, same as any other real item though, with prefixes and suffixes. So when rolling them yourself, you may look out for certain prefixes and then certain suffixes for auging. And when you try and roll your own, you start out with a rare one, you can scour it, turns it into a white and then a blue, and start rolling. Something to mention, you really should probably never roll jewels for yourself because it's just not efficient. When you need a specific jewel for your build, you're usually looking for at least 3 props on a jewel to fit your build. Trying to make one for yourself to fit 3 good properties is really hard to do and really cost inefficient. So you're much better off going out and just buying one that someone else has found that they don't need for their own build and you may need for yours. So it is a really inefficient use of currency to roll your own jewels, but that doesn't stop you from doing it. It is fun to do, and I sometimes do it myself as well when I have a bunch of alterations to then spend and try and make my own just for the fun of it, to skip having to buy them. Jewels can be corrupted, and there are certain jewels that you can only get through corruption, so look out for that, but they are pretty rare to come across, so you're usually better off buying them or just mass corrupting without really worrying too much about the result otherwise, and you may come across some good 4 property jewels. Now that is essentially the basics around the jewel. Aside from how they actually function, all you really do is you have to allocate the point for the jewel. So for example, this won't originally be allocated, you have to press it in the end, and then you can socket a jewel in and take it out at will for free without any cost to your character anymore. If you want to refund it, of course it's refundable just like a regular skill point. When building a character or a passive tree, jewels are actually very efficient, and you should almost always be taking them when you can if they only cost 2 points. So usually you're building a tree something like this, and 1 point, a jewel is always going to be a no-brainer. If you're running around and doing stuff like this, and then you happen to have 2 points to your next jewel, it's almost always going to be worth taking in pretty much every build if you can get your hands a hold of a 3 stat jewel that's going to benefit your character. In that case, 2 passives for a jewel is always going to be efficient for the stats you can receive, because they're almost always going to be worth better than 2 passives anywhere else. And if you can get a hold of good 4 prop jewels, then it just blows any other passives out of the water. So more or less you will always be building with a few jewels in mind. So usually when building a tree you will grab at least something like 3 to 5 jewel sockets, and it's somewhere around the basic amount that you should be getting when building a character, unless of course you have absolutely no access to at least 3 stat jewels. because if it's just a 2 prop, it's mostly worth it, but it might not be. 3 stats are where you're looking for. This build, for example, has 5 jewel sockets, and most you make should have somewhere around that number. And last thing to mention before getting into some more specifics is jewels themselves don't have any level requirements or item level requirements either. So you can use them right from as soon as you can get a jewel socket, which let's just say for argument's sake is level 1, and they can all roll exactly the same things no matter where they were found, what difficulty or what level. So if you find one at level 20, for example, it can roll your endgame stats, and you can go from there, so you don't have to worry about item levels like you do with most other items when making them for the end game. As far as specifics go, let's start off with looking for your own jewels. So you go to PoE Trade, which is our essential online auction house. You'll scroll down to Type, you'll hit Jewel, and then you'll start looking for the mods you want on a jewel. Let's say you're building a dagger based character like the Blade Flurry. You look for, let's say, dagger mods, so physical attack damage with daggers, dagger attack speed, maybe you'll want some life, so typically you type in life and find the increased max life. You try and match the mods that you know exist and can exist on jewels, and then select them. You probably want some, let's say, crit multi while dual wielding, since we're dual wielding, and let's say for argument's sake you want melee fizz as well, so you want increased melee damage. If you search for all of those at once, it's going to be a clusterfuck. What you're looking for is count. So you hit specify the number of mods that should be matched, and let's say we want 3 of them. So you want 3 of any of these mods to be on a single jewel, and when you search, some may or may not come up. We got 20 results. The next level from there, however, is to add a filter group. And what this does is you can then add specifically one of these mods that has to be on your jewel. Like, for example, you're trying to cap out life, you want increased max life. Then when you search for this these parameters, you're going to be searching for any of these 3 mods, but specifically it has to have life on it. So you then search for that, and we come up with 8 results instead of 20, and each of these jewels will have life on them, and then 2 of the other mods that you've specified. Now, it's fairly simple for most characters. You more or less want to load them up with as many as you possibly can that you think you want to use, and it's not too complicated until it gets to things like a Varanastra, which can be used for any weapon, and at that point your list becomes just enormous. Now, when going to price your own jewels, there's kind of a lot of things to take into consideration, but my rule of thumb, I suppose, is if it's a 3 damage prop jewel, something like this, it can't be worth more than, let's say, 15 chaos. It might, circumstantially be worth more, but a 3 damage jewel usually is anywhere from about 5 to 15 chaos, depending on the build and how useful or sought after it is at the time. If it's got a life mod, and then 2 damage props, or an energy shield mod and then 2 damage props, that jewel should be anywhere from about 10 to 30 chaos. Once again, it mostly depends on the demand for that type of jewel for that build. It's when you start getting into 4th properties that things get a little bit more iffy. So fire resist here, for example, is a useful 4th property, but not one that people are going to value too much. So it might add a few chaos value to yourself when you're looking for one, but it's not going to sell for too much more. It's only once you get to 4 damage properties, or 3 damage properties and 1 life property, that things start to get kind of crazy, and prices start to go up to 1 exalt plus. A good jewel that has 4 useful properties should be worth around an exalt, and to me caps out at about 3 or 4 exalts. I personally would never pay 3 or 4 exalts, but that's the maximum I could see them being worth. Any more than that, and essentially you're paying exalts for just like 1 damage mod, and it just doesn't make sense unless you're really rich and trying to completely min-max your character. So a lot of these prices that I see for jewels are just absurd, that I don't think anyone should be paying. They may in fact pay them, and you might sell them at these prices, but it just doesn't make sense for an efficiency point of view when building a character. And lastly, I'll go over what you should be looking for, what sort of actual mods are good on a duel, and what you should be looking out for when making your character. Because not all duel mods were created equal, some are much more worth it than others, and it's all about being absolutely as efficient as possible with your stats and priorities. What I'm talking about specifically here is certain mods are better than others, even in the same category. For example, Global Critical Strike Multiplier, that applies to just about everything since it's global, spells, attacks, whatever, whereas specific ones like Critical Strike Multiplier with cold skills or elemental skills can go a lot higher in the multi category. This goes from something like 9 to 12, whereas these go from like 15 to 18. So they're worth a lot more on a duel because already it's a 50% increase by itself. And that applies for a lot of different crit multis and a lot of different actual categories of dual stats. So what you're looking for is kind of the better ones, like the crit multi while dual wielding. Those go up to 18. You take what you can get, of course, but you are looking for the bigger sort of mods on there. And one of the other mistakes I see people looking for are things like critical strike on a duel. It's just plain not efficient to get, because a duel is, all of the mods are going to be worth one property, and you can only have one property in that slot. So would you rather have 14 to 18 critical strike chance or 15 to 18 crit multiplier, when a crit strike chance is worth so much less on the passive tree and on your gear than a equal amount of critical strike multiplier, which makes the multi on a duel so much more worth getting and much more efficient use of your stat, which you only have one of. Likewise, attack speed can be really good. You can get 4 to 6 on a one-hand melee weapon, or you can get 6 to 8 with maces, for example. So the specific weapon slot ones are much more worth getting. You can get up to 8 attack speed in that one slot. And once again, that becomes far more efficient than something like a critical strike roll or an armor roll. Things that you can fill out on your passive tree otherwise, whereas multi, for example, is quite often one of the limiting factors for damage in a build. When you make a passive tree, you will almost always be limited by your critical multi. You can only get so much. This character, for example, uses bows, and I've taken most of the stuff I can get that's available to me, except for up here, and I have 40 crit multi here and then 64 here. So that's 100. You're then going to be filling it out from your character, from its gear, as well as the jewels. 100 multi, I could fill that out with jewels, with the 5 extra jewels, and all of a sudden I've doubled my crit multi. Likewise with an amulet, can get you another 38 crit multi. That's a huge amount that you can't otherwise get. Whereas you could always get more armor on your gear most of the time, so you don't want armor on your jewels. You can always pretty much cap out crit or get enough crit, so crit on your jewels becomes, by that point, very inefficient to get. So there's a lot of things you look out for that. Jewels are very good for damage efficiency, so I do recommend trying to get really good damage rolls on there and filling out a lot of your damage from jewels. And there's just other things to look out for as you become more and more experienced. Things like a chaos damage roll, for example, can be really good for certain builds, like an Essence Drain, if it uses poison, because then you're double dipping from the chaos damage towards the initial Essence Drain hit, the damage over time, and then the poison damage as well. Whereas for most other builds, a chaos damage roll is pretty much shit, especially if you're only using it as half of your damage or something. It just becomes not worth it. For example, my Blade Flurry build, people think added chaos damage should be pretty good, but it's only half of our damage since Fizz and Chaos exists, and by that point you're only using half of a jewel's property, and it's pretty inefficient. So those are things to look out for and just something you gain with experience, but hopefully you can now identify a jewel that is useful in the future for your character or for other characters, and you don't have to ask your favorite streamer for advice. In any case, thank you very much for watching, and see you guys next time.